Good morning, everybody. Today we continue our series of seminars. We are honored to have Dr. Isam Al-Khafaji, who is giving a seminar titled Reconfiguring the State, Restructuring Communities. Dr. Isam leads a research team on the Middle East Interstate System. He taught at the University of Amsterdam and was a visiting professor at Yale University and New York University, and was a distinguished research fellow at Brown University and New York University. He is an adjunct scholar at the Middle East Institute at Washington and a contributing editor of Middle East Report. He's the author of the academically claimed Tormented Births, Passage to Modernity in Europe and the Middle East, which was translated into Arabic by the Egyptian National Center of Translation. He served as a senior expert to the UNDP for launching Syria's first Human Development Report. He was a senior advisor to the UN envoy to supervise Iraq's transition from the US-led coalition to Iraqi sovereignty. Dr. Khafaji.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for this introduction. You humbled me by that. And thank you for attending this seminar. I have rarely written notes before giving a talk, but my deep appreciation for the audience, made me prepare some of the notes in advance. My appreciation for my dear friend and scholar, Aziz Nadma, for inviting me here. Actually, this was a working title. Now, after reconfiguring the state, restructuring communities, after writing these notes, I feel that I'm not sure that this is the suitable title. I do not know how to call it. Maybe you can help me with that. Let me begin by the challenging project that the CEU and under the auspices of Professor Aziz has addressed, the striking from the margins. Let me begin by addressing the issue of the disintegration of the Middle East, which is now widely held, circulating term. And it has been actually in the air since the 1990s, since the early 1990s, with the occupation of Iraq by the Iraqi regime and the turmoil that took place in Iraq around that. There was then began the talk about disintegration of...
You mean the invasion of Kuwait?
Of Kuwait.
By the Iraqi regime.
Yes. What did I say?
The occupation of Iraq by the Iraqi regime.
Oh.
It's interesting.
Well,
Freudian
later we were occupied, actually, so it's not... 13 years later we were occupied. Iraq was occupied, so it doesn't make a lot of difference. No, thank you for this. Yes. So when I think about it, is the Middle East really disintegrating? Now, when you talk about the Middle East, what comes to mind is 15 countries. According to, nobody can define what is the Middle East, where are the boundaries of this Middle East. I understand the Middle East as the region extending from Iran east to Egypt west, from Turkey, which thinks that of itself as European, to the south of the Arabian Peninsula. That's for me. Now we are talking about 15 countries, actually. 3, albeit important 3 countries, are in turmoil. Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. 2 central states, Iraq and Syria, and let's call Yemen without any ideological connotations as a peripheral country. That's Yemen. These are the countries that are in turmoil. And even in these three cases. We have a civil war in the strict sense of the word in Yemen. We have a multiple factional war in Syria, which I no longer consider a civil war. It's no longer a war between two camps, if one would like to label it, against the regime. One is the regime, the ruling regime, and the other is the popular opposition, or whatever you want to call it. Iraq is, if we leave aside, and this is a big omission, I admit, the bloody fight against ISIS, is witnessing a high-intensity conflict between its components, Arabs, Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, and Kurds. But it's not a war. It's not war. Now, what's most striking, for me, the idea of the concept of destabilization is associated with a no less, according to my understanding, a no less misleading idea that the Middle East is an artificial structure. Its states have been designed by colonial powers, the French and the British, out of the Arab territories of the ex-Ottoman Empire. They have just designated that this entity would be Iraq, the other Syria. And it's not here is not the place where I can delve into the details of it, but I do not subscribe to that idea. And as far as the destabilization or the disintegration notion is concerned, Lebanon and Jordan are supposedly, according to the artificiality theory, are seen as the most artificial structures. Now, when you look at it, Jordan borders Iraq and Syria, the war-torn Iraq and Syria. Lebanon borders Syria. Lebanon, more than that, moreover, Lebanon has just emerged or has emerged from a bloody confessional civil war. Moreover, the all-powerful Shiite militia, Hezbollah, is directly involved in the war in Syria, alongside Bashar al-Assad. Nevertheless, these two countries are as stable as ever. Yes, they are not disintegrating. They are destabilized. Okay, the word stable is I shouldn't use it. Maybe is an exaggeration, but their structure is there, and there is no potential that Jordan or Lebanon are on the verge of disintegrating. They are destabilized. So this idea that let's put this in context, what we are witnessing actually in the Levant, which is Syria and the Grand Sham, the Grand Syria region, plus Iraq, is renegotiating the power structures between the various actors in the region. Renegotiating power structures does not entail disintegration. Rarely have been historically, in the modern history, let's say, and in the post-World War II, with the exception of very, very few countries, such as Yugoslavia, rarely have civil wars led to the partitioning of a country. They led to some kind of a reformulated power structure where the contending party tries to carve as much as possible, depending on the balance of power or the power relations, to carve as much as possible of the fortunes, the wealth, and the political power as possible. But it does not lead, they do not actually, the contenders do not put that as an aim. Now, here I have to put some qualification. I distinguish between what I would call, and I think Aziz would not like it, kind of the national liberation movements, the Kurds, which, whether we like it or not, is a national liberation movement. It's not civil war. Because when you talk about the Iraqi opposition or the Syrian opposition, you are talking about people whose objective is to overthrow the ruling regime and to replace it. But the separatist movements or the independent movements do not have that in mind. They do not even state it. We want the rights of the Kurdish people. That's it. Okay. Now, I think that eventually Iraqi Kurdistan is evolving into an independent state. It's a matter of time. Next year, in 10 years, I do not know. And within Syria, the Syrian Kurds will carve some kind of autonomy, but within a unified state. Now, that would bring us to the topic of the rise of confessionalism and the religious, the inventing religious identities of the new. Here again, I'd like to qualify some of the notes because we will find that there are significant sections of the populations where religious identity is not that paramount among the people. Certainly, I'm not talking about the non-Muslim sects, which comprise no less than 20% of the Syrian population, because according to my understanding, Alawism is not a sect, an Islamic sect. It's an entirely different religion that believes in the Trinity, etc., that does not abide by the 5 tenets of Islam, etc. So if we add that to the Christians and others, we are talking about 20% of the Syrians that have nothing to do with the rise of Islamic identities among the individuals. But I'm not talking only about that. In Iraq, the Kurds, who are no less than 20 also, you do not see any religious people defining their identity, not any. The vast majority of Kurds do not identify as Sunni Muslims or in terms of religion. And that's not difficult to understand. It's a reminiscent of the Arabs trying to emancipate themselves from the Ottomans at the time. You cannot say that because we are Sunni Muslims, we demand independence, because it's against you are trying to emancipate yourself from a Sunni-dominated empire, which is the Ottomans. Their perception, and I'm talking about perceptions, leave aside the so-called objective analysis of the why and how, they portrayed themselves as Arabs versus non-Arabs, and not as the Arabs during the era of emancipation from the Ottomans, their struggle to gain independence from the Ottomans. Today, the Kurds are passing through that same epoch. They define themselves not as Muslims, but as a different ethnicity which has the right to gain independence. That's why, for example, in the consecutive parliamentary elections in Iraq, the Kurdish Islamic parties hardly reached the 5% of the votes of the parliamentary seats. So let's qualify this idea that about the all-pervasive religious identity among in the region. And let's also qualify the idea that Islamic identities are transcending the national boundaries. What comes to my mind always is the inability of Al-Qaeda in 2004 and 2005 and ISIS today of transcending the national boundaries between Iraq and Syria. Although they control large swaths, adjacent swaths of similarly structured societies in Iraq and Syria, in the north of Iraq and Syria, still they could not actually, you could not see any meaningful cooperation between Iraqis and Syrians. Actually, there are now so many reports that there are grudges among the Syrian ISIS members against the domination and the privileges that the Iraqi leaders are getting on their expense. In 2004, 2000, you hardly knew of tribes, although on both sides of Iraq and Syria there were tribal structures. You hardly heard of cooperation between Iraqi tribes and Syrian tribes. You hardly heard about that. Each had its own identity and perception of where they are. Now, let me just jump from that to try to look at the radically new changes that are taking place in our region. The rise of Islamic identities and what they have been producing today. Are these entirely new to our region, such radical changes? And what came to my mind, actually, what has been always in my mind, and allow me to read, that 6 decades ago, Egypt, Iraq, and Syria, as well as Iran, had undergone similar radical transformations in their state structures and in the relationship between individuals and communities with the state. Now, people tend to dismiss a comparison between what is going on today and the 1950s and 60s processes because they have grown up under the then erected systems for decades and came to see them as the natural way of life. We don't see them as equally transformative, radically transformative processes that took place in the 1950s, 1960s. Transforming the existing allegedly secular state systems into religiously based ones has reclaimed our perceptions in such a way that we tend to lump the entire post-independence life cycle of the Middle East through the prism of secularism versus religion today. In this way, the post-World War I history of the Middle East is viewed as a continuum, which has its ups and downs, okay, but it's a continuum. Now, what has happened in the 1950s and 60s, which we gloss over or we just underestimate? Senior military and intelligence officers replaced politicians as the ruling elite. A one-party rule has been established, and the multi-party system was denounced as divisive to a people that is by nature is indivisible. Unaccountable coercive apparatuses and a quasi-unlimited authorities. Politicizing the judiciary, banning any non-state media, creating organized mass organizations, perfecting highly politicized curricula, nationalizing private industry, banks, and commerce, turning the state into a huge business enterprise, confiscating agricultural land, putting religious institutions under state controls. All these were unheard of transformative processes that today we just tend to forget about and see as a continuum when we think about the rise of Islamic identities to say. Not only that, there were changes in the musical styles that were introduced during these with the common. What used to be relegated to special programs such as countryside music, etc. And let me go into this detail. How much? Oh, whoa. So we're always...
No, you have 35 minutes more.
25?
35 minutes.
Okay. I remember before the Ba'ath, the gypsy songs were banned from, and remember, we are not talking about the era of YouTube where you could hear, choose what you listen to. Okay, if you do not have it on state radio or TV, you can't. Gypsy songs were banned from state TV and radio stations. Countryside and Bedouin music, there was a weekly program, Min al-Badi, songs from the Bedouin. With the rise of these regimes, these were just immersed into the mainstream styles of music and etc. So what we are talking about actually in the 1950s and 60s is a no less transformative process that took place at the time. And you may not where my comparison is heading when I remind you that Nasserism and Baathism adopted with utmost enthusiasm strategies to create sister organizations in other Arab countries to topple their respective regimes and install revolutionary ones that would follow their path. Now, you can see where I'm leading. I mean, now that we are talking Al-Qaeda or ISIS creating sister organizations in the Yemen and Maghreb, etc. This is not brand new, actually. This is what the Ba'ath did, but under for different objectives. I may venture to say that just as the world watches the rise of Islamism with horror, the 1950s, 60s were seen equally horrifying because the Cold War epoch dictated the norms of judging a socio-economic system through the prism of socialism versus capitalism. Now we look at the world from the prism of Islam versus religion versus secularism. But this is not. So, how is that the age-old traditions of practicing a moderate lived Islam, which I like very much, this aptly used description in the Striking from the Margins project, have been swept by the more puritanical and violent interpretations to which a significant section of the national people adhere. First, let me qualify that about lived Islam. Lived by whom? Because even during the days of lived Islam, you wouldn't see many non-veiled women in the countryside. Actually, we are talking about the city centers or the big cities when we note that there is a change from lived Islam into a more conservative Islam, if you like, or more puritanical Islam. We are talking actually about the cities because in the countryside, even before this process has begun, alcohol was not heard of in the countryside. So a lot of these things, I think, despite the fact that, well, when you talk about the cities, you are talking about a majority of the population, I admit. But also, this is something that I think does not contradict what I'm saying, that I like and I agree with the notion of lived Islam versus the new modes of Islam. But still, let's look at it from a different perspective, if I may. Now, how has that and why has this changed? Nationalism has been always in the air. The nationalists, the pan-Arabist parties, Ba'athism, did not create nationalism, did not invent it. It was in the air. Otherwise, how did our countries gain independence from the Ottomans? Islam, the lived Islam, has not been invented by these fundamentalists. What happened is the rise of new social actors. These are the people who could not identify with lived Islam. Why? something that's quite important, and the Striking from the Margins project mentions it. The changing the qualitative change, if I may say, in the structure of our societies over the past 50 years because of the huge flux of immigrants from the countryside into the cities. Now, moderate Islam, lived Islam, Azhar Islam, these were seen as you could identify them with urban centers, actually. For immigrants, these did not resonate with the way they understood it, Islam. And here, people always talk, scholars also, about this dichotomy, countryside versus urbans, rurals versus urbans. What we overlook normally is a category that's between the countryside and the cities, which is the provincial towns. This, I think, is a very crucial concept to understand what happened in the 1950s and what is happening today. The provincial actors. Now, statistically speaking, I have looked at the statistics of the immigration during the 1950s, which led to the nationalist revolutions, or coup d'etats, whatever you want to call them, and the waves of migration that have taken place during the 1990s, etc. No doubt, the vast majority comes from the rural backgrounds. No doubt about that. But the rural migrants are inarticulate, semi-illiterate. They could not impact the structure of society. They could not impact the cultural norms of society. By cultural norms, I include religion also. Those who could impact it are actually the migrants from the provinces, البلدات, الضياع, تكريت, جبلة, قرداحة, إلى آخره. These are why, statistically speaking, these are infinitely smaller. The number of these people is infinitely smaller than those who migrated from the rural parts of the country. But these are the people who have attained some level of education. They come to the cities with the hope of entering police academies, military schools, etc., or occupy posts. These are the people who, when they settle in the cities, find that they are shunned by these cities, by the urbans. Their upward mobility is blocked because the system is not expanding. And that's why they are shunned by them. One of the greatest modern Arab poets, Badr Shakir Sayyab, has a poem which, when he migrated from a village close to Basra, Jikor, to Baghdad, a very famous poem, Baghdad is a great brother. Baghdad mabghan kabir. And now, what distinguishes the provincials? Provincials are almost homogeneous in terms of ethnicity, religious affiliations, standard of living, level of education. Most of them are engaged in one and the same economic activity. They are alien to the diversity of urban life and structures. Hence, monolithism is part and parcel of their worldview and everyday practice. Dissidents, according to their perception and worldview, dissidents are no more than collaborators with some foreign enemy. Exploitation is not a process, it is a conspiracy against the Arabs. And now it's a conspiracy against Muslims. This is what distinguishes the provincial mentality. they come from homogeneous backgrounds, ethnically, religiously. And this has been also the case with Islamists, just as it was. Added to this is that those wretched masses who had heard of the opulence of the rulers and the urbans and their proteges before emigrating were now eyewitnesses to the mushrooming of exclusive clubs, the five-star hotels, the sprawling villas, and the luxury cars of the privileged, etc. So here we have to distinguish between an equally misleading concept of putting the crude class way of looking at poor versus rich. I propose to distinguish between integrated poor, the urban poor, who share a lot of common concepts with the other urbans, middle-class urbans, and between those provincial poor. They might share the same standard of living, but the urban poor do not view the world the way the immigrants view them. And here also, I think, is the way we have to look at why do the provincials have no problem with destroying the social fabric. Now, the Syrian revolt is a magnifying lens on how my understanding is, I can express my understanding. The revolt began in urban centers and not in Der'a, as the widely held conception goes. In the beginning, it was, and still was, the changing the regime, changing the political order. And with the provincials, who came to dominate the war now, and it's not no longer a revolution, have no problem with destroying the social fabric. They have no stake in this existing social fabric. And this is what distinguishes the two categories. This is where puritanical Islam has played a role in the hater towards established Islam, the Azhar's Islam, if you like to say. This is where you can find the roots of it. Those immigrants cannot identify with a state-sponsored Islam. And the Azhar Islam and the Jami' al-Amawi Islam is equally alien, just like urban life and the diversity of urban life to them. Now, I would come to my final remarks. Okay, the question is now, okay, why is it Islam that people have turned to? Okay, there is disappointment, despair from the 1950s, 1960s dominant ideologies. Baathism versus communism. And these were the major opposition groups until the Pan-Arabists came to power. And even during the Pan-Arabist power, you had the communists and the Baathists with varying degrees of popularity in the different Arab countries. Why is it Islam was almost non-present in the political life of the region at the time? Egypt presents an interesting, I wouldn't call it exception. And the Muslim Brothers were established in 1928 in Egypt. My explanation for Egypt, and this is just in passing, I'm saying it, is that when the Mashriq gained independence from the Ottomans, they viewed their problems, the Mashriq people viewed their problems as being part of a decaying Islamic state, religiously dominated empire. And now it's time to liberate ourselves from such kind of domination try to catch with the European model of secularism. Now, the Egyptians actually were complaining from a different problem. They had already gained their independence, de facto independence from the Ottomans by the 1830s, when Muhammad Ali, they were under the yoke of the British in 1882, and they viewed the world differently. Actually, if you go to the literature, the Egyptian literature of after the fall of the Ottomans, you will see a lot of chagrin towards the fall of the Ottomans, of the defeat of of the Muslims. And there was a time in the 1920s, when the British were toying with creating a new caliphate, Islamic caliphate, where King Fuad of Egypt then becomes the new caliph, and the center of the new caliphate would be Cairo. Egypt represents a different case, but in our case, Islam was not a political actor in the Mashriq, neither in Iraq nor Syria or Lebanon, etc., until the 1970s, actually. We began to hear about Islam as a player. My explanation is that the word progress has lost its meaning as a value and a norm among the general populace. Remember, in the 1950s and 60s, the struggle was people had high expectations from independence, etc. The infighting and the conflicts between the different political organizations or different schools was who would achieve these goals better than the other. We, the communists, or the pan-Arabists? Who can deliver advancement, development, modern values better than the other? By the end of the 60s, there was total despair among the populace of the whole idea of progress. It was the idea of how do we preserve ourselves. And here I go to what my friend Aziz has worked about on invoking the past as a glorious image. When progress is no longer a value, you will look at the world differently. And here is where Islam has come. Because the question that I think not many have thought about is, sometimes there is this subjective way of thinking. Because this or that ideology has gone into oblivion, Islam has come. But why is it Islam? Why wasn't it liberalism, for example? Why wasn't it whatever philosophy? Why is it Islam? It's taken for granted that if pan-Arabism and communism have decayed, then Islam. Why Islam? And I think here lies the root, the explanation for it, that people have lost any progress was no longer a value among the populace. Look at the slogans. Look at the programs of the Islamic parties. You wouldn't see any talk about what do they plan to, what are their plans for the future to raise the standards of living? What do they think about improving the educational system? And people, their audience, do not think about it. They do not care about that. Okay? They care about how to preserve some kind of existence facing the non-Muslims. And it's here that I think that the idea, their perception of the world, just as the immigrants of the 1940s viewed the world as we Arabs being exploited by Europeans who are non-Arabs. Now the perception is we Muslims are exploited by non-Muslims, Alawites, etc., or non-Sunni Muslims, despite the fact that actually there are anyone who lived in Syria or in North Syria. There are actually it did not begin as a sectarian-based movement. The Alawite fanaticism, or because it was tribal, it was kinship. There were so many oppressed tribes among the Alawites. The Hadidiyin of Salah Jdid were sidelined, actually. Now, with the rise of the polarization, Alawites feel that they are threatened and they are coming closer together. But it wasn't the Alawites versus... And the same goes... But it's one thing to analyze this objectively. It's another when you look at the perceptions of people. And these perceptions are widespread now, and they are nurturing the idea of revival of an Islamic-based identity. An Islamic-based identity, this becomes destructive because, as I said, just the immigrants, the provincials, feel that they have no stake in a continuum of the existing institutions and transforming them into more modern one. They don't see any problem with destroying the Azhar's teaching. They have no problem with that. Their norms of life actually are quite different. Actually, they go at loggerheads with that kind of teachings. This attachment to an Islamic identity can be seen that it's not an attachment to the beliefs, the literal beliefs in Islam. It's kind of loss of hope in any future, in the future. That's why what's interesting today is that you see side by side, you see the preponderance, the pervasive of fatalism among the Middle East people that stands against Islamic teachings. Practically all Iraqi dailies today and TV channels have horoscope programs or features, which is against the teachings of Islam because only God knows the future. Okay, and you see those believers, okay, just are so fond of them as much as they are fond of Islam. Okay.
Senator, just a little detail, if I may. I saw figures recently of the amount of money Egyptians spend on fortune telling every year. It's in the billions of dollars.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not the literal. It's just kind of a attachment to some kind of despair, trying to put your future on, come what may. I tried to squeeze, and I think that my attempt has not quite succeeded because I had to jump from one topic to the other. So my apologies if there are inconsistencies in what I have been saying. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting and thought-provoking talk. And I want to just, as a way to encourage you to elaborate on some of the thoughts you just raised, I wanted to raise some questions here. First of all, I will start with the main thesis of your talk, which is that it's not about the artificiality of the state. It is about restructuring power relations within the state, which I personally agree with. But I also wanted to see what's your opinion of those who think that at the same time what we are seeing is more mobility cross-border. For example, the Lebanese-Syrian borders, the Turkish-Syrian borders, the borders between the Kurdish areas of Iraq and Syria. I mean, there's so much focus on the Iraqi-Syrian borders, but we know that the areas surrounding those borders are mostly desert areas. So even in terms of logistics and fighting, they are not that useful for groups like ISIS and others. But we see, for example, Hezbollah's involvement in Syria. And in a way, this mobility, those processes of crossing the borders on daily basis, don't you think that they are also, in a way, changing the nature of those borders? So the interaction across borders are becoming so intense in some areas that this eventually will create new realities. Also in terms of the Turkish-Syrian borders. My second point is I'm really encouraged by your interesting, nuanced differentiation between the provincial and rural. And I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate more on what characterizes this provincial character, and in what conditions and circumstances this, what you described as provincial solidarity and homogeneous groups start to act as a monolithic group, trying to change the dynamic within the urban centers. Especially that I know, for example, what you have described as a province is not by necessary falling in the characterization you just described, like areas such as Ana and Rawa in Anbar. They are provinces, but they are also well known for being more liberal, more tolerant. Tikrit itself, in a time, there were Jewish communities living in Tikrit. And this differentiation between the rural and the provincial also make me think of for example, the migrants to the Sadr city. They are mostly from the rural background, and they are also adopting Islamism or their own version of Islamism. And I don't think they are, or maybe I'm wrong, I don't think they are very much influenced by any provincial mediator between their countryside of origin and the areas that they migrated to. And my final point is that about the Kurds. So in a way you are saying that the Kurds have a national liberation movement, and it seems to me that for you a certain type of military action is legitimate if it has a certain ideology. And this ideology in this case is the national liberation ideology. But even here, are we talking about a pan-Kurdish national liberation movement, or a Syrian Kurdish liberation movement, an Iraqi Kurdish liberation movement? And in this case, if you agree that there are also differences between those Kurdish militant groups, to the extent that in Sinjar today they are fighting each other.
Exactly, this is what I was going to.
So, what do you mean by the Kurdish National Liberation Movement? Thank you.
Thank you.
Shall we continue taking the question?
As you wish. I have actually a related observation, a related question, having to do with provincials. Again, having to do with provincials. Now, if one were to look at the way in which women would have dressed 30 years ago in the countryside, be it in Syria or in Iraq or elsewhere, I would not actually label this as veiling. I would label this as local modesty codes. I'm not finished yet.
No.
The same would apply. The same would apply to the abaya in the United Arab Emirates today, which again betokens a local status in the same way as a man would wear his dashdasha and so on. If we exclude countries of the Upper Gulf, which had an earlier exposure to the world, Kuwait and Bahrain, where you have quite a number of women who do not veil at all, who do not cover their heads at all. Saudi Arabia is a special case because of state policies from the 1920s. And you will find that in terms of this kind of dress...
Just one puff.
In terms of this kind of dress, just one, please.
But a deep one.
Yeah. In terms of this kind of dress, of course, it varied from village to village.
That's right.
Even from the little villages surrounding Damascus, every village had a distinctive form of dress. What we have been seeing in the last 30 years is the adoption of a uniform. It's the adoption of an ideological and of a uniform. It looks like a uniform, it acts like a uniform, it is perceived like a uniform, whereby the provincial lady sheds her normal attire of modesty and adopts something which is fairly uniform. And of course, uniformity also has quite a number of variations within, depending on where it originated, right? There are different ways of wearing veils, right? Which cloth merchants had actually designed and made it available very, very widely. And let's not forget the role of cloth merchants, incidentally. This is a very, very interesting aspect of the way in which these things, in fact, work. So, whereas previously there was simply a social habit, now there is something which is laden with quite a lot of value-added sense and meaning. So that's number one. Now, for the provincials, why should we assume? Well, first of all, the religious practices of provincials were not, especially for those educated elements or the upper echelons of the provincial towns, not in any distinctive way different from those that prevailed in the centers, including official matters and unofficial matters, saints' tombs and saint worship, and which incidentally are returning in many ways, despite the presence of Wahhabism. So I don't think that there is much that can be made of the dissonance. Now, what I see is crucial in the analysis here, and I do perceive the importance of provincials. In Syria, for instance, one takes Idlib, for example, or Daraa even. Although the people although the Syrian security services, particularly the torture squads, are quite often recruited from the city of Daraa and the villages surrounding it, for a variety of reasons that we can discuss. They are very interesting socially. But that these provincials were subjected after or in tandem with the decline in state cultural hegemony that we've seen over the last 40 years, and the intervention of alternative networks of religious authority, mainly of a Wahhabi coloring, and many of them with extremely generously funded, incidentally. I think this is the crucial element in the transformation, rather than something pre-existing, homogeneous, coming to town and then finding itself at variance with the conditions of the town. The things at variance with the conditions of the towns is, as you mentioned, the lack of opportunities, not much chance for promotion, the networks, the business networks, which are lacking in effectivity for a person who comes from the countryside and maybe opens a shop or whatever it is that they do. So I think we really ought to be careful with this certain presumption of a pre-existing religious condition, which then continues in the cities. And the second point I wish to raise with you is your definition of the provincial. That is to say, let's say of a generally provincial character. I would concede that there is a global provincial character. That is to say, a character, a number of features which would designate provincials everywhere, and in every town. But I don't think that homogeneity is one of them. You had very much emphasis on homogeneity. I don't know how this works.
Great remarks from both of you, and I agree with many of them naturally, but I cannot elaborate on the very, very important, because they are important actually. We will need so much time to discuss.
We can listen to you until they throw us out of this room.
But
we have 30 minutes.
I think the audience would throw me out of the room.
No, I'm just being a little bit cheeky. Never mind. Please forgive me.
there are some conclusions that I did not deal with, actually. Some statements that I looked at them, or I thought that they are so axiomatic that I wouldn't go into, because all of us know the role of funding, harassing or oppressing the Islamists during the secular stuff. These are things that I think I did not delve into them, because I thought that, yes, these are reasons why the Islamists did not. They might explain some of the reasons that you did not have Islamic parties or etc. Yes, funding, but why is it that people, what I care about is not how Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi thinks. What I do not care about in this respect, not what objectives do the leaders of Al-Qaeda think. What concerns me is why do people acquiesce to them? Acquiesce not under pressure, not under coercive means. And by acquiescence, I do not mean by force. Acquiescence, according to my understanding, is such an umbrella, such it ranges from passive acceptance to warm welcome. Something that is not, when you are not hostile to an idea. Now, the question is, Saudi finance has always been there. During the fight between progressives, the Nasrat camp in the 1960s, and the Saudis did have plenty of money, and they did try. Why is it that people were not receptive of these ideas? Money, yes. Funding, yes. And it has been there. Why have people become so receptive of these ideas? And this is where I concentrate, emphasize the notion of the loss of hope in progress. There was a Gallup poll in around 2007. Which country do you see? It was among Iraqis and Syrians, if I remember well. Which models do you see as the best suited for your country? And Saudi Arabia ranked well high on the agenda, on their models. Why? Because it provides welfare, stability, security, etc. Now, this was unthinkable in the 70s, even in the 70s, in the 60s. Now, so turning now to the two other important, no less important things, crossing the borders. Yes, you're right, but it's all over the world. I mean, this doesn't change when you raise the question, the Kurds came to my mind. The same example that you mentioned came to my mind. Yes, they talk about national Kurdish aspirations, the creation of the Kurdish Ummah. Once I told Imam Jalal, that was the ex-president Jalal Talbani, I told him, you're just like the Arab nationalists of the 1950s. Once the yoke of our oppressors go, we will unite. We are just separated because of the enemies and who dismembered our nation. But when Arabs gained independence, they discovered that there are societal facts that they cannot go beyond. So, whether there is cross-bordering today, but Iraqi Kurds feel that they are different from Syrian Kurds. Not only that, actually, within Iraqi Kurdistan, there are these deep societal cleavages, which I'm pretty sure that they will come to the surface once the Kurds gain their national.
They have come to the surface at many points, actually.
Yeah,
in the past.
They are already there, but now they take an ideological guise between the Patriotic Union and the Kurdish Democratic Party. Actually, it's between Erbil and Suleymania. This I cannot dwell on that in detail at the time now because of the limited time. Now, the very important issue that both of you have raised about provincialization. I did not give any transcendent genetic characterization for the provincial people. Socially speaking, in many aspects, provincial people, in many aspects, not all, they are more socially open. Okay, and witness to that the provincials in Syria, the Alawites were okay, and still are. You can characterize as provincial people. Now, what I said is that the structure of their living makes them more or less homogeneous. They see the world in terms of homogeneity. And this is what concerns me. They are first articulate in the sense that they have an impact on society and politics more than others, than the illiterate, semi-illiterate peasants. A Sadr city is actually an epitome of the empowerment of the ex-illiterate, semi-illiterate immigrants. What I'm talking about is those who attained some level of education, who see their lives as destroyed by, not because of their own compatriots, but by foreign powers. Look at Ana, you mentioned this. Look at Tikrit. Tikrit used to live on the Kalaks. These are the boat rivers that transport goods from Mosul in the north to Baghdad. Ana was specialized in the weaving of abayas, the women's gowns. I wouldn't call them veils. Now, with the flooding of French textiles in the early 20th century, the industry of abaya just eclipsed, disappeared. With the coming of the modern means of transportation, Tikrit just died away. Now, these people tend to view the world as others conspiring against it. They do not see it as a process, a socio-economic, technological process. This is where when they emigrate to the cities, the big cities, the officers in the Ba'ath Party in Syria, they view the world as, and I will give you an example, as Damascenes versus non-Damascenes. And actually, there is a very interesting, in the memoirs of Abdul Karim Zahruddin, the ex-chief of staff, he notes this, that we were eclipsed, we the Damascenes, by those nouveau coming, not nouveau riche. Okay, yes. And look at the infighting in Syria among the early Baathists, the Druze against the Alawites, etc. Even within the one and the same organization, the Ba'ath Party was actually, as pan-Arabist ideology, began in the cities. Look at what happened when they assumed power. The Aleppo, Damascus-led party, the Damascenes and Aleppo, Amin al-Hafiz, Salah ad-Din al-Bitar, etc., were just shoved aside. And the provincials came, not out of a conspiracy, because they were more in tune with the new population, with the needs, if you like, with the requirements of the new population. Urbans could not see that. So the cities shunned these people, and those immigrants felt that they are shunned. This is the idea. In 1985, Saddam Hussein had invited an American pseudo-scholar who, Christine Moss helped, who wanted to polish his image. And at the time, naturally, he was the beloved of the West, Saddam Hussein, because he was fighting the Iran. And he said something that I cannot that I kept in my mind. I told her that, look, unlike the south of Iraq, we had no exploitation within our community. The differences in our standards of living between us and the sheikh were minimal. If the sheikh did something that we wouldn't like, we will chase him with a stick. The Southerners would not do that. The Southerners are the peasants. This is the difference. They cannot see the world in terms of that society is divided, inherently divided into classes, into diverse fields of activity, that it's natural that you have the Armenians, the Christians, Arabs, Kurds, Persians living in the city. The natural thing is that we all belong to the same ethnicity, probably the same tribe, etc. This is what colors their view. Okay, so when they come to the colleges in Baghdad or in Damascus, when they come, they are shocked with this. Their worldview is that there is a conspiracy. Okay, that the soft life of the urbans, okay, cannot be explained other than that there are foreign powers conspiring against us. And this is where the idea of we have to keep the purity of Islam. We have to among today's Islamists, we have to keep the purity of Arabs. This is where it comes. Okay, so provincialization of the world, it's something that could be discussed forever.
Dr. Isam, thank you for being here and thank you for the presentation. So many points of agreement and so many points of disagreement as well. But instead of getting into the nitty-gritties, I will try to take the discussion forward based on the comments by Haris and Khafaji as well. So bear with me with a bit of a long premise, but I will try to be concise. You started the discussion with a focus on the disintegration of the Middle East as a genetic model that we use to try to capture the transformations happening in the Middle East today. And obviously the logo miserably fails. And you touched on how we still define the Middle East as a collection of more than about a dozen countries defined by their state structures and their artificial borders. And naturally, if we are going to assess the disintegration of this entity called the Middle East, by defining it through its state structures and artificial borders, our assessment will be limited to these factors. Like, as much as we try to sort of go beyond, we will still be focusing on the state structure and then pivoting off into other areas and try to talk about, stuff that you touched on, like the province, for instance. And here, for me, this sort of highlights a quintessential problematic that the project tries to focus on, which is the conceptual tools that we use, the conceptual building blocks have a huge implication on what kind of an assessment we will get. And we try to develop a new conceptual tool, new vocabulary, new tools that we can use to actually talk about it. And here I can't help but refer to your article, De-Urbanizing the Syrian Revolt, which I was rereading it yesterday. And you have this very dynamic and nuanced explanation of three different social formations, which is the urban dwellers, the tribes, and the provincial inhabitants, which have sort of, their relations have evolved based on context. And at the same time, individually, they have reacted differently to the broader processes that underwent. So reading in between the lines, I almost got the impression that you're a proponent of locality as a conceptual framework. Yeah. Now, I think this is quite important because based on that article, you do capture the complexity of the province itself, meaning it's not homogeneous. Economic pressures and environmental pressures in Syria, for instance, have affected different provincial areas differently within Syria. Exactly. We talked about Aleppo and how in the civil war, Aleppo wouldn't come to the revolution, but the revolution had to come to Aleppo and whatnot. So to what extent do you think locality is the way to go about studying the Middle East these days? Let's put aside the state structure as a starting point of our analysis, but start with a discussion about the locality, not only as, I'm not here defining locality as a territorial extent, as a geographic area only, I'm talking about it as a local site of socio-political contestation that had its own agency, that had its own causal processes, interacting and reacting to broader processes. I'm a little bit biased because I do endorse this approach of approaching Middle East politics and society. I'm wondering where you stand on the topic. Is that what we should do? Is that where we should be going in our analysis? Are these the tools that we should be developing?
I like this comment very, very much. I don't see any disagreement between us, actually. When you
Well, I didn't want to go into disagreements.
No, I know. Actually, this is what invokes the thoughts. But I do not see any disagreement between us. Look, when you talk about locality, you are talking also about interdependence. I mean, yes, Deir ez-Zor is a province, and in this little thing that you are referring to, deurbanizing, I defined a province not in terms of the population size, not in that a unity that depends on other centers to market, because after all, Deir ez-Zor and this region is the food basket for Syria. It produces 80% of its natural, but it depends on Damascus and the banks, etc., credits. This is what I mean by a province. Now, there's no contradiction. I think, and thanks for calling it a dynamic analysis. I think dynamic analysis requires this, that you cannot just pigeonhole units here. Yes, Deir ez-Zor specializes in this or that. I'm just giving it as an example. Tikrit specializes in this or that. But it cannot live by its own. And the tribe also. Tribes cannot live just as self-sufficient unities. But you can define them more or less, okay, as people who group around some norms, kinship relations, socioeconomic activities. This is what I mean. So I don't see any contradiction in that. Okay. Now, are these political units that we call today states, do they reflect actual realities, national structures or not? Actually, I would not go into that. I wouldn't bother thinking about that. But for me, there are facts on the ground that a Basra Iraqi knows that he or she cannot live without Baghdad. Okay. Now, is it out of a sense of we, the Iraqi nation, or not? That's different. A Hamawi knows that he or she cannot live without Damascus. Why? That's something that we can go on till eternity to analyze. Some of them look at it as national spirit, etc., but they know that they can. Now, this has been reinforced with the rise of rentierism since the 1950s. The rentierism and actually the drive for the independence of Kurdistan wouldn't have become possible without them turning into a rentier center. They are producing their own wealth. Okay, so rentierism has not only the potential, it is actually binding people. Sometimes people reluctantly, but they know that they have no other way but to depend on the center, on Damascus. And someone would say, but oil does not compose any meaningful percentage of Syria's wealth. Well, there is something called strategic rent, which I have not invented, but it's quite an interesting concept. That
yes.
Syria depends on what's called strategic. It used to use its location to bribe, extract resources from rentier states, from its heavy hand in Lebanon, or occupation, if you like to. So they used to extract resources from other rentier states, and this is how the state got enriched itself and divided and dispersed the spoils with different fortunes to their proteges.
Is this your coinage?
No, I have to be modest about it. No.
الرأي السياسي
Right, strategic lens. Using your strategic location.
Any question, any comment?
Yeah, I've got so many questions actually, but I suppose the big one is a completely new analysis to me. The concept of the liberal cities, the poorly educated peasants, and the people stuck in the middle, the provincials who actually see no hope. They have been tempted through, perhaps you could define it as an export of Wahhabism to become more radicalized because there's a gap in hope and a future. So I think that for me just gives two questions, because I'm a very pragmatic kind of person. One, what can we now do to solve the issues for the people there? And secondly, how can we prevent it in the future? Small questions.
Very small question.
The most mind-boggling questions are what you think of as simple, and Okay, I am not the right person to ask, to be asked such questions. Otherwise, I would have been a politician. No, honestly, I mean, this is a question that لا ترجموا مثل سؤال شكو ماكو. Okay, I mean, it's what can we do? If I knew what to do, I would have gone to do what we should do. But this idea about provincials, etc., which I think requires more on my part. Okay, and thanks to your insights. Look, it's this might explain to us that why is a perception of Sunni Muslims against Alawis is transient. It's when you perceive, not necessarily that's the truth fact, that your identity is threatened by a minority, a coterie of Alawites ruling you. Okay? Once the Sunnis dominate the political field in Syria, you will find the cleavages between Aleppo and Damascus, between tribes and all of them are Sunni Muslim. Identity, and that's, I think, for people like you, established scholars, identity is defined by altered identities. Okay. Now, when you are in this position in Syria or in 1990s Iraq, we the Shias, the oppressed Shias against Sunnis. Okay. But when your hegemony is there, while you were asking the question, I was thinking of the 1960s Iraq before the coming of the Ba'ath, the short period of Abdul Salam and Abdul Rahman Arif. The Sunnis were there, okay, dominating, and it was a explicitly sectarian-based regime, the Arif regime, especially Abdul Salam Arif regime. Now, you have this cake and you want to partition it, but it's too small. So, the infighting, and it was a bloody infighting actually, came among the officers between the Mosulite bloc, the Tikrit bloc, and the Fallujah or the Anbar. At the time, Anbar wasn't used, between the Fallujah bloc. And these were all Sunnis. But when Sunnism was no more in question at the time, at least, the divisions were created and
competition.
Exactly, within that Sunni. So it's a fluid concept. it's a fluid concept. Now, in my lifelong work on transition to modernity, I tried to trace that and compare it with the suburbs of of Paris on the eve of the French Revolution. Okay, and I found that actually the immigrants hated each other. They lived in separate. I mean, we cannot talk about immigrants en bloc. You have the Tikriti immigrants who hate the immigrants. And the same goes for Syria. The same goes for Beirut. I've worked on I didn't produce it, the map of Beirut and the immigration to Beirut. And you could see it. The northeast is, the Armenians are here, the Janubis are there, the Shia are there. Because there is a competition on a limited amount of resources and jobs. So this is where I find it quite exciting, that you cannot just stop, say, provincials, rural, and urbans. Within that, there is a fluidity, but there is something in common. The worldview among provincials, that the natural way of thinking is homogeneity. This is the natural way. And if I fall on diversity, then there is something wrong. There's something wrong with Damascus. There's something wrong with Baghdad and so on.
Okay, no more questions. So please join me in thanking Dr.
Thank you very much again. Thank you.
Thank you.